Hi, I'm Paulina, CEO of Spakinect, and today I am talking to Justin. Justin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having me. Always great to chat. And so I am Justin with Marti Law Group. So we have a law firm that specializes in medical aesthetics and med spas, and pretty narrow focus. We do a lot of regulatory work with the med spas, transactional work, and also M&A. So mergers and acquisitions, obviously private equity has discovered the med spa space and aesthetics. And so we've got a lot of folks inquiring about buying spas and selling. So that's become a big part of our practice area. So really narrowly focused. I mean, this is such a wild industry that, it's definitely a full-time job for all the attorneys at our firm.
That's right. And you came from the dental space prior to getting into medical aesthetics, is that right?
It is. I kind of am, the accidental attorney, I feel like is the term I use, or when I first met you that I kind of default to, which truly I feel like I am. So I come from a very operational background, having if folks are familiar with an MSO, a management services organization, which we can talk about. I had a dental MSO, or what we call a DSO. And so we started with a couple of dental practices. I'm not a dentist, but I partnered with a dentist, and we kept opening locations across the Northeast. 12 years later, we had about 45 locations in the Northeast and a bunch of partners. And we were approached by a PE group. We ended up exiting, selling that off. For some reason, I thought it would be fun to go to law school along the way there. Truly no plan on practicing, but just kind of had a thirst to keep learning. And once we exited, I just kind of found myself in M&A, having just gone through that exit. So we really started in dentistry. And it's funny now, while dentistry is still some of our business, aesthetics, it's almost like dentistry 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, that the PE groups are getting involved. So we kind of got pulled into this wild world, and truly it's, the majority of what we do now.
And I think that there are some parallels between the dental world and the aesthetic industry that we can draw upon later as we talk about some of these scenarios. So thank you for sharing that with us. So I know that Connecticut and Massachusetts are two states where you have a lot of clients or have a big presence. So I wanted to talk about that today a little bit. Spakinect is now offering services in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And so we do get a lot of phone calls from clients who have questions for us about how to properly set up their medical spa or their aesthetic practice. Obviously, we're not attorneys, so I always like to defer to other attorneys for those questions. But in general, I think it could be helpful to answer a few questions that we get along the lines of, let's take a hypothetical scenario and just run with it for these questions. So let's say you have an RN who's a very experienced injector, and this RN wants to start her own medical spa. In both of those states, can you tell us who can own a med spa?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I will say we work across the country. We work in a number of states, and our team is spread throughout. But obviously, being in Connecticut, which is where I kind of sit, and coming from our group starting in Boston, our dental group. So we have a lot of roots, obviously, in both states and around New England. And so Connecticut is a very interesting um, jurisdiction. Basically, Connecticut is, and people get confused with what is the corporate practice of medicine, or CPOM as we call it. What states are CPOM, what states are not. And so I think that the answer, to a lot of these questions really starts right there. And like, who can own a med spa? Um, so CPOM, or the corporate practice of medicine, not to give you a whole history here, but it really does dictate a lot of the terms and ownership requirements. And so basically, when it's kind of a legal doctrine that sometimes it's state statutes that kind of dictate if it's a CPOM state or not. Sometimes it's more like a medical board opinion. Basically says, in order to own a medical practice, which probably the one thing states agree on, they don't agree on much, but one thing is certainly that med spas are, the practice of medicine. So CPOM talks about a medical provider must own, a licensed physician generally must own a medical practice. Now, there's been exceptions with kind of the evolution of independent practice for nurse practitioners and physician's assistants. But at its core, CPOM truly says like non-licensed person, you can't own a medical practice or a med spa. What's interesting, and the states are pretty split, about 50-50 or so, whether there's CPOM or not. What's interesting is that Connecticut, on its books, in its regulations, is a CPOM state, but this statute came out in 2014, which kind of just threw everything for a loop. And it's a very short statute. It was intended just to address med spas because they were starting to grow in popularity. And truly, the way it reads and the way it's been interpreted is that anyone can own a med spa if they employ the right people. So that's like a huge shift because CPOM, that's like the total opposite. In
Right.
order to own something, you got to be a physician or an MP. But
Right.
then this regulation comes out that kind of has been interpreted as, hey, you know what? Anyone can own it as long as you employ these people. So that's kind of where Connecticut sits now. So, we are a little more conservative. And I always tell folks, like, if you want to go by traditional CPOM, which is in Connecticut, I think a lot of folks don't think we're a CPOM state. But I explained we do have CPOM. If you want to go by the regulation, it's really a risk tolerance on how comfortable you feel with owning this, knowing, if there's a medical board investigation or something, you've got to make sure you're comfortable with any exposure. Um, and then Massachusetts is interesting because it is also a corporate practice of medicine state, has independent practice. So a nurse practitioner and a PA actually can own their own clinical entity. And so they're a little bit more strict though when it comes to the regulations around the med spa. There has to be, what they call a clinical director who has to be on site 10% of the time. There has to be a site director, and they can be the same
Do,
person.
do they do they define what is a clinical director?
Yeah, so the clinical director is, more of probably the easiest way to understand it is like the clinical director is more what you think of as a traditional medical director, so
Okay.
they've got to spend about 10% of their time on site. And that's not the case, of course, in every state. Um, but about 10% of their time on site, doing the chart reviews, doing the chart audits. And then there's this site director person, which is a little unique for most states. And this person has to be fully on site. And they're kind of overseeing, day-to-day operations clinically. And generally that is the spa owner, right? Like the person who's there injecting. So it's kind of different, terminology for the same type of roles, the
Mhm.
medical director, but a lot of nuance in both of these states, ironically, where, some states are pretty gray on it, don't talk in too much detail. Other states are very, very clear, whereas Connecticut and Mass both kind of have like their quirky regulations around med spas.
And I appreciate you bringing this up when I asked the question. You are licensed, or you have people that are able to practice in all 50 states? Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So
Okay,
we have
perfect.
attorneys at this point, across the country. We're actively adding more. But yeah, we're, state or nationwide, countrywide, we're basically able to handle transactions.
Fantastic. So thank you for clarifying that. And for the purposes of this video, we'll stick just to Connecticut and Mass because, like you said, it's incredibly, it can get confusing and overwhelming looking at all of these states, right? Every state is so different and has all these nuances. So back to what you were saying about the clinical director and the site director. I think one thing that stood out to me is what you said is it's about, or maybe it was about Connecticut, it's about your level of comfort with risk tolerance. And I think maybe what I'm starting to hear more and more as I talk to more attorneys in this space is that a lot of the regulations can be a bit up to interpretation in that sense, where it even attorneys will say, look, this is what I recommend. Like you're saying, you're more conservative. This is what you recommend. But at the end of the day, it's really about your level of comfort as a business owner and how much you are comfortable with risk.
That's right. I mean, we constantly will talk to a client or potential client, and they'll tell us another attorney told them something different. And I understand that that's really, really frustrating for
Mhm,
people in our space.
mhm.
And it is truly because, I mean, it's still relatively a younger industry. compared
Right.
to, some other verticals in healthcare probably. And so there is still a lot left open to interpretation. Again, not everywhere. Some states are really clear on things. But generally, I would say no state's very clear on every subject in the world of med spa. So there is a lot of area left to interpretation. We have some firms that we know very well respected, but they'll tell folks something a little bit different than we will. And I think we do sometimes tend to be a little more conservative in certain areas just because of the risk that folks run into. If you
Yeah.
open a business and you spend millions of dollars to do your build out, and then you're told by the nursing board, you can't own this.
Right.
So yeah, there's definitely a lot of I mean, we have attorneys on our team that all their job is research, constantly researching regulations. And as you know all too well, as soon as you figure out all the regulations, things change.
Mhm.
So we need to kind of navigate that also.
Yeah, absolutely. I know people can get very frustrated because they just want to know the answer, right? Just, I'm
Correct.
sure you hear that as we do too.
Correct.
I just want to know, can I do this or not? Just someone please tell me the answer. So it's
Right.
not always as easy as a black and white answer like that. So let's continue on our hypothetical situation, this RN injector. Let's say she now is opening a med spa in Connecticut. So in that state specifically, does the MD or NP have to be on site?
They do not have to be on site in Connecticut. Again, kind of, you know, contrary to what we've seen in Massachusetts, but
Right.
in Connecticut, they do not have to be on site. Now I say that with, kind of an asterisk, right? We want to make sure that the medical director, whether it's an MD,
Mhm.
DO, NP, whichever acronym we go with, or PA, that they are doing, periodic chart reviews. And in our world, I really want to see an involved medical director, and certainly there's services out there that kind of will get folks linked up with a medical director, and there's varying levels of involvement. For us, like I can't harp enough to the client. We want the medical director to be involved. If they're on site, great. If they're not, we get it. It might be difficult to have them on site all the time, but definitely have a cadence, have a structured schedule to when they're going to do chart reviews, how many reviews, are they available, after hours, or if they're generally we want to have a backup medical director if they're away. So as long as those perimeters are kind of set out, they don't need to be there full time.
Okay. And that actually made me think of a question we get often is there a proximity requirement, a physical proximity requirement for that medical director?
Not in Connecticut or Massachusetts. In a number of states, there certainly are. We've seen Utah and some other locations where there is a region they have to be within, whether it's mileage
Mhm.
or time frame or time span. But yeah, in these states, they're not necessarily required to be within a certain region. Again, I want to see that they're involved, hopefully, and
Sure.
and virtual, of course, is certainly fine, but we just got to make sure that involvement's there.
Right. Absolutely. And we touched on a little bit about CPOM, which thank you for that. I feel like that's a more trendy term now. More people are knowing what CPOM is when we talk about it. So um the next question I have for you is about GFEs or good faith evaluations. So if you were to take on this RN injector client and she asked you, what treatments are going to require a GFE, what would your answer be?
I would say call Paulina at Spakinect, and no, I would I'd be very clear with this RN that a GFE, our again interpretation and the way we want folks and clients doing things are to every single new patient needs to have a good faith, evaluation done. Um, and it doesn't necessarily mean, as you know very well, that the nurse practitioner, the medical director, the physician, they don't have to do that whole intake process, right? Paperwork can be gathered by somebody and the RN can have a discussion with this patient. But we need at some point, whether it's they have somebody or they're utilizing a service like Spakinect to have that properly licensed person to do their portion of the screening, make sure they're going over the medical history and making sure they're a candidate for the treatment.
Right.
Once that's done with the patient the first time, then we can begin to see the patient with some regularity. If medical history changes, and that comes up, obviously, when a patient comes back in, we would like to have one done again. And we'd like also some kind of cadence to it. Some folks, annually, if they're doing a new GFE, we love that. But I think it's really important that they know, because we do have people who tell us, hey, I'm an RN, right? I don't need good faith evaluations done. And we're like, no, you very much do. So we want to make sure that every new patient has that.
Right. I think we also get that question too, and I'm actually an RN myself. So, I'm fully aware of the breadth and restrictions of my scope. And I think that, like you were saying earlier, in medical aesthetics, things can get a little bit gray because it's a relatively new area of medicine. But I always think back to, my days working in the hospital, and that anything that I'm going to administer to a patient in a medical spa, I equate that to the same thing as if I was in the hospital, right? And I'm giving patients a medication. I can't do that on my own. That would be obviously outside of my scope. I can't prescribe, I can't order. So understanding that and being able to relate those two things, that, any of these treatments that you're getting at a med spa is a medical treatment. Botox is a prescription medication. So it does require an order from somebody who has the prescribing authority within their scope.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you hit it. I actually love the analogy because I think it makes it really clear as to
Mhm.
why, you would need these things.
Right. It feels very benign, right? But, things can happen, and that's why it's just not within our scope to be able to prescribe Botox or any other medical aesthetic treatment.
Right. Right.
So I want to move on to some of the general questions I had just about the medical spa industry as a whole, knowing that you are licensed in all 50 states, or your practice can serve clients in all 50 states. I'm sure that there's a lot of, things that you've heard and clients that have come across your way. And so I would love to hear, what are your top 3 do's and don'ts for somebody who is starting a med spa today?
So it's a great question. And we touched on a couple of items, but we'll kind of loop back to them to make sure, I capture them in my three do's and don'ts. I mean, I think the number one do is to know your state regulations. We probably, one of the, if not the most common question we're asked is, can I own a med spa? Can I own this IV hydration clinic? Can I own? And so, unfortunately, as lawyers, right, people don't want to hear it, but our initial response is it depends. And we try not to, have them roll their eyes right away, because we want to follow it up with some substance. But it truly does depend on your state and on so many things. Like we talked about CPOM, corporate practice of medicine. We touched on independent practice for nurse practitioners who can have their own, their own practice essentially without a physician. So those things are at play here as to who can own. And so oftentimes I've actually started off, we talked about an MSO briefly, a management services organization. And so your state may say that, Paulina, you're an RN, you're not of the proper licensure to own this medical spa, you need a physician. But guess what? We can probably structure an MSO arrangement that gives you the ability to truly run this operation, and really fulfill your dream of having this spa. But there's a certain structure we have to implement to make sure that that happens properly and we remain compliant. So I always start with knowing your regulations, and it's incredibly frustrating to try to Google this stuff or chat GPT it, right? And people
That
get
is
mixed
true.
answers. And
Don't
that,
ask Chat GPT.
yeah, our only takeaway today is don't ask chat GPT. If nothing else. But medical board opinions are ambiguous, and nursing board. So that's really where we start, and we take a deep dive with people into like explaining their state regs and why we get to our position that we get to. Again, we touched on medical directors, but I just can't harp enough that we do see a lot of folks when we see folks get into hot water with a nursing board or medical board, oftentimes an investigation starts with, okay, who's the medical director? Let's see the involvement, the chart reviews, and let's see the history of all that. And it's also, what's the good faith evaluation process look like? So those are probably the next kind of do's that I want you to have, is really, do have an involved medical director. And again, make sure you have a cadence and everything's documented well. We're lawyers, right? Go figure, but everything really clearly articulated,
Mhm.
what the medical director is responsible for and what they're not responsible for. So I
Mhm.
think having that clear, and then of course, working with a great GFE partner, whether it's somebody they have in-house, whether it's like someone like Spakinect, I think that's so, so important. And truly it's a little concerning to me how oftentimes overlooked it is when we get a new client and we have to map some of that out for them. So I always commend them for taking the steps to fix it, but there's just so many folks out there that, will be told, so and so I know does this, and or they don't require all these processes and they don't need an MSO. And
Right.
no, actually they do. They just, they don't have it, and that's their risk tolerance. It's a little scary, but
Right.
we want people to lead the right way.
Absolutely. So knowing your state regulations, having a medical director who's involved, and working with a trusted partner in the industry who's going to provide you knowledge and support along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. And what are some frequently asked questions that you get from your clients? You probably touched on some already, but I'd love to hear, like, what's the most common question you get?
It's still, I'd have to say, it's still, can I own this? Or I was told maybe I can't own this. Um, we see a lot right now of folks, as you probably do, with interest in either IV hydration or medical weight loss, with the kind of craze around semaglutide and
Right.
tirzepatide. So we get a lot of questions of, can I have this, wellness business, or can I, how do I implement this thing? Am I licensed properly to do it? So all very much, it depends type of scenarios, unfortunately, but we parse it apart and we go through it. So once we establish, like, hey, let's figure out the scope of practice, what you want to actually do. What kind of bucket do we put that in? Um, then we can kind of figure out, okay, you can own this thing, right? And you can own it, or maybe you can't. We need this MSO structure. And then we talk more about, like I said, the FAQs are who can do a GFE, who can be medical director. And so these things, like, I've beat a dead horse a little bit with some of these, but it's so important that people really work through that and use, hopefully, work with a med spa, a specific attorney. If it's not us, then, one of the few other folks who do it, but it's so, so important that you work with these advisors who know the space, because it's just so hard to unpack all of it. And so
Right.
I think, ownership, the good faith exam, again, and even understanding who can, compound. That's a big thing now with
Mhm.
IV hydration and medical weight loss. Is compounding allowed? Can I do it in the office? What's a good
Right.
compounding pharmacy? So these are, a lot of the FAQs that we get, and they're all such big rabbit holes that we could go
Right.
down, but truly, navigating through a lot of that. And of course, there's overlap. A lot of aesthetics practices are layering on these other services. So we kind of
Right.
look at it, holistically.
So that kind of brings us back to the topic of risk tolerance, right? Is that if if you are going to open up a med spa, there's a lot of things you need to know if you want to do things by the book and you want to do things right. And I know that obviously you're going to advise clients on what best practice is and what you feel is best and most conservative, safest approach state by state. What would you say if someone were to ask you, look, I'm doing all of these things to be as safe as possible, but what's the likely risk that, or the likelihood that my small little practice, would be investigated by the medical board? How would you answer someone who asked you that question?
It's such a great question, because this comes up all the time, and folks are like, I have a small, I do it 2 days a week, and I don't need this
Right.
MSO, and I don't need this. But I think we've both seen, right, that the larger you get, the more eyes that are on you, the more employees you might have had, the more patients you've treated. And I truly tell people, and again, a lot of this comes from my experience, not just as an attorney, but as an operator of a dental group, a practice, kind of like, med spa. Like we said, there's a lot of alignment there. So we had 45 locations, and it's not a matter of if you're going to get an investigation from a medical board or a dental board or a nursing board. It's just when, based upon the patient volume and based upon how many employees you've had. So the complaint at some point in time in your journey of building this thing will come in. It could be a disgruntled employee or ex-employee. It could be a patient who maybe they got great service, but they don't believe they did. Or, maybe it's a competitor, unfortunately, who is kind of making things difficult. But usually one of those three are the drivers of a complaint or a call to the medical board. And then the medical board or nursing board has a duty to investigate. So that's when the process starts. And so I would say there's a risk no matter what, right? Because we are in a very specific field and very regulated field of healthcare, of medicine. But as soon as you're kind of starting to get at scale and you're really treating, a heavier patient volume, I think the risk is there. We're dealing with a matter right now in Maryland where it's a one location med spa, but very, very well known, very successful, amazing people, right? And they just treat a lot of patients. So patient files a complaint, they believe they didn't get the service they probably thought they did. And, whether that's true or not, I mean, that's for everyone to kind of work out, but it triggered an investigation. So now, we're dealing with responding to the boards and, showing the paper trail of what the medical director's involvement is, what the good faith exam, all the things we hit on earlier. So it is very real. I think that's the thing. I hate to like be the lawyer that just scares people
Mhm.
into stuff. Like we've never wanted to be that be that point of view. But I do think having again been in the driver's seat of one of these of a healthcare entity organization, like it's very real. The risks are
Right,
very real. It's really scary when the dental board or the medical board shows up. So,
right,
having your stuff documented, having your processes in place that, you feel pretty good that if they come in, like you're, maybe you're not perfect, but if you're pretty close and you're doing the right thing, you're probably going to be
right,
okay.
right. And I'm assuming if somebody is working with you, Justin, that if they were to be investigated, that's something that you and your practice would help them through and be able to talk to the investigators on their behalf.
Yeah, we do a lot of we're very transactionally based firm. So like the stuff I talked about, whether you're starting your spa all the way up to growing it, hiring people, selling it, that's kind of our wheelhouse. As part of that, we do help folks respond to these letters. We don't litigate, so I always tell people, if we get to a point where we're just not getting anywhere, whether it's with the medical board or the patient or we will kind of bring in, the proper parties to partner and help out. But yeah, it is very scary when that letter comes in from the board. So we, try to help people, talk them off the ledge a little bit and craft a response.
That's very good to know that you don't litigate. So let's take it back to this RN practice. Let's say she's looking for an attorney to partner with as she's opening her med spa. What types of services would you be able to offer this practice, and how do you make it, affordable for somebody who's just starting out their practice?
So we are very much a flat fee firm. So again, I don't want to knock lawyers or the profession of law in general, but having gone through an exit and, built our dental organization and sold it off, I mean, the legal fees were pretty significant. So
Right,
when we started this journey, it was really intended to just do things very differently, and probably what we would have liked when we were working with counsel. So it's a flat fee depending upon the scope of work. So if someone's buying a med spa, selling a med spa, or they're just hiring an injector, we even starting off and they just need to form an LLC, and that can be a daunting
right,
task for some people. We,
right.
figure out what's the scope of work. We give them a flat fee. And it's nice because we can talk as much as we need to with the
Awesome.
client or with the other side if there's another attorney and kind of work through that process. And they're not like, you sent me a text, 0.1 hours that I'm billing you for.
Right.
Um, the
I
other
think
piece,
people appreciate that too.
yeah, I feel like it's been well received, and that was my hope, that they know going into it, hey, this is the cost, and
Yeah.
sometimes legal fees they're not the cheapest, but at least you're aware like this is what it's going to be, and we're not going to go beyond that.
You don't have surprises. As a business owner, you're starting your practice, you don't want to get a surprise bill.
Right, right. And the other thing we've done, which has been pretty fun, is for a lot of clients now they're joining our membership program. So it's, you know, a little bit more unique, I suppose, to have a membership for a law firm, but it really is meant to just be all encompassing. So we'll get someone who's just starting out, very nervous about the whole process and how they set things up. So we'll work with them month after month after month, and we'll go through their consent forms, or you know, we can even start with just forming the organization. What do their consent forms look like? Building that out, and every month we're just building upon this foundation. And we now have a whole member portal that's got the consent forms and state-specific regulations. You know, we try to go a lot further than probably some other kind of platforms that are out there. We'd like really like to show, hey, this isn't just the law, you know, on the scope of practice, but here's like literally the citation where you can go and see, and is it current law or is it not? We found in working with different groups that there's kind of broad statements out there, you know, this licensure can do this licensure can do that, but we're like, is this still accurate? Has it changed? So we've been really hands-on. It's been great. We just launched our member portal, and clients have been super happy. They also get like a certain amount of attorney time with us too, so we can kind of brainstorm on ideas. So that's the other thing that we're doing for clients, and it's been really fun to kind of like get positive feedback.
That's exciting. That sounds very valuable as a client to have access to all those resources.
We have videos on there. I think the worst part is that it's just me talking, so they probably like, all right, I'm over this guy. But aside from that, you know, it's been pretty impactful.
So Justin, my last question for you today is more of a fun question, but it
Okay.
is, if you were, let's take our RN injector. We should have given her a name, maybe. Let's
I
call
know.
her Julia.
Okay.
Okay, if you're going to go into Julia's practice and you could choose any treatment to get at this med spa, what are you getting?
Oh my gosh, this is an amazing probably the best question I've ever been asked. There's so many options. I mean, I am 43 now. I'm seeing the crow's feet a little bit more than I'd like.
You don't look it. You don't look a day over 40.
And I think the Zoom filter is doing
Yeah.
exactly what I needed to do. So I think, you know, there'd probably be more Botox than I initially intended when I walked in.
All right. I would agree with you. I just started my Botox journey a couple months ago. So I think once you start, you don't stop.
That's the sense I get. So it's only a matter of time now before I cave.
All right. Well, thank you, Justin, for being here with us. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me and for everything you guys do. It's been great.
Awesome.